When I was in high school at Catholic Memorial High School in Waukesha from 1984 to 1988, so the height of the heavy metal 80s and all sorts of other things, I hung out with a group of people that were called, at that time, burnouts. And there were a lot of different, we could say, subgroups that I'll talk about in just a bit. But the story today has to do with a particular clique or group or crew of them who called themselves Midnight Sales and Services. And I was younger by 1 year than everybody else in it, but I ended up kind of joining it and doing some, what at that time we would call security work for them. And Midnight Sales and Services was a bunch of guys, some of whom were eventually friends of mine, some of whom were just, acquaintances. And their motto was, if you want it, we can get it. If you've got it, we can get it. Because what these guys were doing was breaking into cars and other things as well, and stealing things like radios, radar detectors, and then selling them in the city of Milwaukee to people who would buy them from them and then, actually pass them on to other sellers. So they weren't selling directly to customers, with rare exceptions. They were selling to what you could call a criminal wholesaler, right? So how did I wind up getting involved with these guys to start with? So when I entered Catholic Memorial in 1984, it was high school, and I was going from having gone to a pretty rough rural elementary school setting to a middle school that was private and very exclusive and academically oriented, where you were either rich or you were smart, and there wasn't much overlap between the two, and it was quite small, to a big high school in the middle of Waukesha. And because it was a Catholic high school and not a public high school, kids were coming from all over the place. So all over Waukesha, parts of Milwaukee, parts of other counties as well. And, I started out there, and I knew just a few people from my previous middle school, maybe 2 or 3 tops, and everything else was going to be new. And over that summer, I had gotten super into heavy metal and was listening to a lot of that, growing my hair long as much as I could because my mom would often bribe the hair cutters to cut it shorter than I wanted. There's a whole video about that when she was working at the School of Aesthetics and Cosmetology, where I'd get free haircuts and other things. So, I was wearing, somebody actually summarized my dress at that time, which is really kind of ridiculous, as either shiny, sleeveless, or black. And I, had things like the fake leather pants. I wanted to look like a rock and roller, right? And I'd gotten also into weightlifting over the summer and had kind of a growth spurt. So I was tall, I was the height that I am today, 6'3". I was this tall when I entered high school. My growth had happened in 6th and 7th and 8th grade. And I was about 140 pounds. So I was pretty skinny, but I was getting better through, lifting weights, packing some muscle on. As a matter of fact, by the time I finished high school, I was about 175 pounds. So I enter high school, and one of the things that you have in high school is what's called study hall, right? So study hall is like in a hall, or in this case, it was in the cafeteria, and you're expected to bring your stuff along with you and quietly sit and study, and you can confer with your fellow students. And there'd always be a teacher or two assigned, and they usually would turn a blind eye to what we were doing. Now, I was also interested, as soon as I went to school, in being on one particular sport, because I had been obsessed with it since childhood. I should actually do a video about this. If you'd asked me what I wanted to be when I was a kid, I would have said sword fighter, because I was into the Three Musketeers and Zorro and all that kind of stuff. So I saw that they had fencing, and I was like, I'm joining the fencing club. That's something I want to do. So I ended up doing that in track, but track is a whole other story. So anyway, I'm in study hall, and, it's like maybe a week or two in, and I recognize some of the guys from the fencing team. Now, these are all older than me. They're like sophomore on up. And so I go over and sit with them because I don't really know anybody. And, they start talking to me. And one of them, Andy, tried to bully me. We actually called him Pizza Face, unfortunately, because he had terrible acne. And, like a lot of kids who themselves get pushed around and bullied, he saw somebody new coming in. Oh, I can bully him. And I didn't let him do it. It was just a verbal exchange. Or maybe we pushed each other a little. I don't know. So anyway, he's trying to give me a hard time, and then I'm giving a hard time back. And so the other guys are like, oh, okay, cool. This guy can stand up for himself. And I met a bunch of them who were on the fencing team at that time. So there was Marty and Peter from Sabre. There was Jim and Ed from Epee. And there was another guy, Steve from Foil. And then Andy didn't actually fence, but he was sort of on the periphery of that cluster of guys. And there were some others as well who weren't on the fencing team. Like I remember there's Bob Four was there. And so anyway, they want me to sit with them, and they're asking me, like what I do and what bands I'm into, and telling me about the bands that they're into. And then they let me in on their little secret. They've actually brought nude magazines like Playhouse and Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler, things like that into the study hall. And they're doing the thing that you see people doing like in the comic books or cartoons, where they've got one book and then there's another book inside of it. And so we're all like looking around and staring at this stuff. And, there's a lot of speculation going on. Back then, a lot of guys didn't know that much about female anatomy. And so there were things that were, kind of objects of curiosity, you could say, and speculation, and then argument back and forth about, no, that's not the case, or this is the case, and stuff like that. So anyway, now I'm in with these guys, right? And that's kind of a good thing because, in high school in the 1980s, depending on where you were, there tended to be, as you've seen in movies, a lot of cliques and kind of a pecking order, right? So at Catholic Memorial, kind of near at the top, you would say there would be what we often called the lake set, the kids who were, super rich and their parents had houses on the lake and they could throw big parties and, wear designer clothing. And we would call them preppies too as well. And then there were like the jocks, and there were different, groups of jocks depending on like what you were into. And there were a lot of overlaps. Like if you were on the football team, you're probably doing wrestling. You're probably like doing discus or shot put in track. And, basketball was kind of a different group, but there was a lot of different overlap. And then of course the cheerleaders and pom-pom girls were often connected with the jocks. There were the female jocks too. There were the nerds who were like into, higher level mathematics or sciences or computers, which were just becoming big at that time. There were the punk rocker kids and alternative music group people that we would often just call the freaks. And then there were the burnouts. And the burnouts, often called by other names. I forget exactly what Bender in the Breakfast Club got, titled as, but it wasn't burnout. Burnout was sort of the standard term for the kind of people that I hung out with at that time, who typically, were into heavy metal and hard rock and, would go to concerts if they could. And, the ideal thing was to have a leather jacket, but failing that, like a denim jacket or something else that was considered cool at the time. You wouldn't be wearing like a Letterman jacket. That was for jocks, It's sort of their uniform. And along with it, so the metal, the dress, there was, like kind of oftentimes being smart or being dumb. But if you were smart, you probably didn't get great grades, right? And engaging in some criminal activities, which might be like stealing things or might be, burglary, breaking into people's houses or businesses, or drug use and drug selling. So like there was a guy who actually was a big drug dealer who commissioned me in my art classes to make a bong for him. Of course, it shattered in the kiln because the art teacher had seen a million of those. He was a couple years, like 2 or 3 years ahead of me. He actually got busted for selling coke out of his locker. And so that was the end of him. And there were a ton of burnouts in the class of 87 and a ton of burnouts in the class of 89 and not that many in my class. There were like maybe 6 or 7 guys and another like 5 girls or so. But so we often ended up like hanging out with the older or the younger people, and me more often the older until they all, like graduated. So anyway, I'm hanging out with these guys, and, one of them I get to be really good friends with, Marshall, who unfortunately died quite young. He was actually in a car accident with my sister and her boyfriend who was driving at the time. There's another story to be told about that. He was in his early 20s when it happened. So anyway, I start hanging out with these people and, doing more and more things with them. You go to parties, and you get invited by a girl, and her circle of friends isn't all burnouts, but includes others. But your burnout friends go and you catch a ride with them. I didn't have a car, so Marshall, actually, once he kind of took me under his wing, would drive me everywhere, And, we did a lot of fun stuff, a lot of screwing around, killing time. There were bonfires. We would drink beer and sometimes hard liquor and get, kind of wild at parties. And, sometimes there were fights or things like that, or we'd play fight. We'd pick up, a lot of us were fencers, so we'd get like wood dowels and go after each other. So anyway, that's that. I was also hanging out with some of the jocks and some of the nerds, because I was, friends with quite a few of them. But the burnouts were kind of like my group. And so anyway, after a while, I'm hanging out at Marshall's place, and because we would do things like play Axis and Allies and, video games and stuff like that. And Peter and Marty and somebody else stopped by, and they're talking about like breaking into the school and stealing the computers. And I'm getting really nervous about this. And I think it was kind of a test because, at some point they're like, okay, we're going to go do it now. And I was like, all right, well, I guess this is what it means to belong to a group. So, all right, I'll go do it. And, then plans changed and we didn't do that. But they took me along on a lot of things. We would go to concerts and see local bands and other bands. Like it was a tradition that every time AC/DC would come, somebody would get tickets and we'd all go see them. We saw Iron Maiden together. We saw a couple other bands together as well. But a lot of it was like driving around to random places where they had, hidden away caches of stolen radar detectors and stereos and other components you could get out of cars. They also stole from the railway as well and, infiltrated other places. There was some sort of weird, government-affiliated place out in the middle of nowhere that I'd come across, and I wasn't in on that, but, Marshall and actually my sister and a couple other people went and, got through the fence and robbed that place. So, they were doing kind of risky stuff. And I remember they started, by that time, that I'm involved with all of this kind of stuff. We're talking about like my sophomore and junior year. I'm getting bigger. I look pretty bulky. I've got a black leather jacket. I like to be looked at as a tough guy, and it's pretty messed up psychologically as well. Going through a lot of stuff. So it's the 80s, and one day Marshall calls me up and he's like, "Hey, I got a job for you. You got to help me out with this." Me and Marty and I forget who else. It might have been Peter. It might have been Ed or somebody. We're going to drive into Milwaukee. We got to make this deal with these guys, and you got to be packing, So I was like, okay, well, I don't have, in my family, we didn't have guns because my dad was against them. And even after he died, my mom still wasn't going for that sort of thing. But I did have other stuff. So in my black leather jacket, I put underneath it a hatchet that I used for chopping down trees, like, pretty sizable one. And I brought some other stuff with me as well. I think I brought like a stick and I had butterfly knives at the time. So I had those in my back pocket. And I was like, oh shit, what am I going to have to do, But you don't want to back out of any of these sorts of things. So I go along and I see the money exchanging hands and they're doing the deal and all of that sort of stuff. And it was, went without a hitch. And we go outside and we get in the car and I'm like, I'm glad that's over, right? And I think it was Marty who's like, yeah, they thought that you were carrying like a gun in there, like a sawed-off shotgun or something, because they saw like the bulge from my hatchet, because it didn't fit quite perfectly. And that was the first time that I went along to help them essentially fence stolen goods. I never did the stealing, although Marshall tried to help me out and show me how to break into cars a variety of different ways and like what you'd have to do to get a radio out. Radar detectors are easy to snatch them, right? But I wasn't very good at doing the thing with the coat hanger and all that. I mean, Marshall had it down to a science. And so they never expected me to do that. And I think they were like, yeah, he's a smart guy, a cool kid. We don't want to get him in trouble too much. He's younger than us as well. I was considerably younger because my birthday's in August. So I was like the youngest in my class, let alone the other. I just looked older and kind of acted older when I knew what I was doing. If it was something I didn't know about, then, I could be a complete dweeb. So anyway, that was the group that I hung out with, and we did lots and lots of stuff together. As I mentioned, a lot of partying, drinking together. I mean, I would say I started drinking pretty regularly when I was in high school, because everybody had beer all the time, It was just one of those things. You always knew somebody older who could get it for you, an uncle. Some of the guys were actually in the Army National Guard, and they'd know older guys, and they could do that. So, yeah, there was a lot of that sort of stuff going on. I dated some of the girls in those circles and some girls out of those circles as well. And, by the time that I was a junior, these people were all seniors. And then they graduated. And then, it was just me and the other smaller group of burnouts who weren't, I was friends with. And, we would do things like, do martial arts together, skating, swapping tapes and stuff like that. But I wasn't doing criminal activity with them. The way that the midnight sales and services were much more hardcore into that sort of thing. Every once in a while, we'd go on to massive construction sites and break in and see what there was. And we never actually found anything valuable, but it was interesting to go around. And sometimes there'd be dogs we'd have to run away from. But that was that. And, the younger burnouts, they were into other different stuff. So, I remained friends with some of these people for quite a while, but the gang kind of split up. So Peter went off to film school in Oshkosh and came back kind of a jerk. Marty turned out to be just a complete scumbag. I actually had to threaten him to not go out with my sister because I knew how he treated women. I did remain good friends with Marshall until his untimely death. And I have remained friends with Ed from high school, who was one of the smart burnouts. The smart burnouts, too, by the way, didn't usually do the drugs. It was the dumber burnouts that were. And then there were a few others. For example, we saw some of them at Marshall's funeral. We hadn't seen them for a long time. And there were others that I've seen from time to time, but we haven't stayed in touch except for me and Ed, and that's really about it. So long time ago, we're talking about the late 80s, and it was, kind of like being part of a club or having camaraderie. Probably wasn't the best thing for me, but it was better than just being on my own. And the good thing about our group is, we could handle ourselves. We'd run into people who wanted to beat us up, and we'd fight them and beat them up. Or, there'd be a intimidation on both sides. The jocks really wanted to go after burnouts at our school as well. So that is the story of Midnight Sales and Services. Maybe I'll tell you some other stories down the line about what high school was like in other senses, but this is a good place to leave off here.